A fascinating world lives under the ocean waves, even in our world. Strange fish swim in the depths, hunted by creatures we barely understand. As a world builder, the ocean holds even more fascination. The potential for building a world under the ocean is enormous and fascinating. Today, I want to delve into exploration and transportation, warfare and combat, but all of those underwater. Welcome to another episode of Just in Time Worlds with your host, Marie Mullaney. Just before we get into today's video, if you want to help me make more of these videos, check out how I implement fantasy world building in my books, The Sangwheel Chronicles, and the novel I wrote with my podcast partner Drake, Magic Fall. Links to the books are available down in the description. You can pick them up from Amazon or any of the other major retailers. And every book bought does contribute to making more videos on this channel, so thank you very much to everybody who has bought my books and left kind reviews. Okay, enough of that. Let's get cracking with logistics underwater. So the first topic we're going to talk about is underwater exploration. Navigating underwater is a vastly different experience from traversing land or air. One of the most formidable challenges faced by underwater civilizations would be the act of exploring the depths. As we dive deeper into the ocean, the pressure increases exponentially. This isn't some gradual incline, it's an increasingly steep curve. The darkness, too, plays a significant role, as light from the surface doesn't penetrate very deep into the ocean. Hence, any species adapted to these harsh conditions would likely have developed special psychological traits or tools to survive. We're talking about the equivalent of underwater mountaineering equipment, perhaps even magic or advanced biotechnology that allows for the adaptation to these hostile conditions. I think such depth exploration could be an extreme sport in your underworld civilization, and much like mountaineering, it would require specialized equipment. So if your species lives in, say, above the 1,000 meters, for them to explore down below 1,000 meters would take special equipment. And let's talk about that specialized equipment that your species would need. 1. They would need pressure-resistant armor or chemicals. A physical protection from the crushing pressures of the deep ocean would be vital. While water, which is what most of fish bodies are made out of, is not compressible, there comes a point where even the cells of creatures becomes affected by the immense pressure of the ocean, and they need special chemicals to survive. And so if your creatures, if your underwater civilization had armor, they might domesticate giant isopods, creatures that naturally withstand high pressure due to their strong exoskeletons. Alternatively, your species could engineer biotech solutions, growing pressure-resistant armors from coral-like organisms that thrive in deep-sea conditions. On the chemical side, if your creatures are going down to the deepest part of the ocean, they might use trimethylamine N oxide, a chemical which is present in the marina snailfish, and this helps them preserve the integrity of their cells, which would otherwise have the proteins crushed together, as I understand it. I'm not a chemist, so speaking under correction here. 2. Your species would need illumination devices. To combat the perpetual darkness, bioluminescent organisms, such as certain species of jellyfish or deep-sea anglerfish, could be harnessed. These creatures could be domesticated, or if your world has biotech, their bioluminescent genes could be spliced into other organisms to create living torches. Then you would also need heat insulation. The deep sea can be freezing, so a tool for heat insulation will be required. I did speak in a previous video about making silk underwater, which you can check out in the information card. So you could make clothing that is heat resistant. Or potentially you could make a device like our hand warmers that we use up here in winter that retains heat, a kind of hot sack that your species could put close to their skin. Magic could also be employed here to generate heat shields or warm clothing. Then you will need communication devices. Communicating in the depths of the ocean where sound travels very differently and signals can easily be lost is another challenge when exploring the depths. I spoke quite a lot about communication in my first video on underwater civilizations, which you can check out in the information card. So you could check that out for some strategies for underwater communication. Then oxygen supply. The deep sea is not rich in oxygen, and your intelligent species might not be able to breathe down there, just like we struggle to breathe on mountaintops when we explore upward. So to ensure a steady oxygen supply, your intelligent species could utilize some of the very deep sea creatures like tube worms that engage in chemosynthesis. So chemosynthesis is the conversion of chemistry elements into energy, the way plants in our world turn sunlight into energy, if there is sunlight. Chemosynthesis does the same, but for chemicals. If your civilization could domesticate some of these organisms and their form of chemosynthesis produced oxygen as a byproduct, you could breathe via these creatures as long as you keep feeding them the right chemicals. So you could have this little breath device that consists of these creatures that use chemosynthesis. You feed them the chemical and they excite oxygen, which your species can then breathe from. I think this would be a really super cool solution to the breathing problem. Of course, in a world with magic, perhaps there would be spells that extract breathable oxygen directly from the water itself, or you could even make oxygen and carry it with you in some kind of container. And the last point to consider with deep sea exploration is buoyancy control. So bear in mind that diving down to the depths is quite a complex business. In scuba diving, we have these lead weights attached to our belts or in weight pockets these days that offset the body and the suit's natural buoyancy because your diving suit is quite naturally buoyant. So you're going to need to consider how your beings actually dive, especially if they're adjusted to like 1,000 meters or whatever, they're going to need weights to carry them down. The other thing about buoyancy is remember that when they come up, there could be complications, especially if your species is an air-breathing species. They could get the bends. The bends is caused by rapid changes in pressure during scuba diving when dissolved gases, mainly nitrogen, come out of solution into the bloodstream and form gas bubbles in your circulation. It can affect almost any area of the body, including organs like the lungs, heart, brain, joints, and skin. And unlike your lungs overexpanding, it can happen to free divers and even to whales. It's been seen in whales that beach themselves due to the bends. So lung overexpansion could be a problem if you had that little breathing device, because if you breathe oxygen down at, say, 1,000 meters, and then you ascend while you hold your breath instead of blowing bubbles, your lungs expand because that breath is now put under less pressure and your lungs blow up like a balloon. But the bends is a different problem and can happen even to free divers because they come up too fast. So in terms of your buoyancy control, think about how people descend and how fast they come up. And bear in mind that even if they live permanently in the ocean, they're adjusted for a certain level. Their buoyancy is neutral at that level. So for them to go down or for them to come up, that's going to involve some adjustment, swimming techniques, or some kind of equipment. But the deep sea isn't the only part of the ocean for our intrepid merpeople to explore. Let's shift our attention from the deep sea trenches to the vibrant coral reefs. Imagine bustling underwater cities teeming with life, where the reefs play the role of resource-rich hubs. These would be hotspots of biodiversity, perhaps acting as the bread baskets or the economic centers for these civilizations. They might even delineate territories, acting as natural boundaries for different communities and tribes. Each reef could be treated as a city-state in its own right. But what happens when tribes want to expand, as happened in our world on land? How do people migrate and colonize new reefs? The discovery of new reefs would likely rely heavily on the species' knowledge of currents and sea temperatures, as these factors greatly influence where coral reefs develop. Your sentient species might employ animals like sea turtles or certain fish species who naturally migrate or seek out these conditions as scouts or guides. They could literally travel with turtles in order to see if they can discover new reefs. In addition, your species might use tools akin to our sonar technology, which could either be an advanced form of echolocation using domesticated dolphins or whales, or a biotech solution involving the clips that create the clicks that allow that sound to be sent out and returned. These solutions could identify complex structures of a coral reef from a distance. Then in terms of, let's say, a new coral reef is discovered, in terms of the colonization, I would imagine that they would take certain domesticated species with them to the new reef, like sea urchins and starfish. In my video about underwater home, I spoke quite a bit about homes and cleaning stations and so on. So I would imagine that at least some of those materials and domesticated species would be required to colonize the new reef. And I think underwater civilizations would lean heavily into domestication and utilizing animals far more than we do on land. Of course, there might be people or creatures already living on that reef, and that could lead to combat and warfare, which we will talk about a little later in this video. In the meantime, back to travel and exploration. So what if the reefs are far apart? How would people travel between these underwater city-states? Well, let's talk about mass migrations. The sardine run is an amazing spectacle where sardines spawned in the cooler water of the Agulhas Bank off the coast of Africa migrate to the warmer waters of Mozambique on the eastern coast of Africa. That kind of massive movement of biomass could be used by your intelligent underwater species to follow migrating fishes, using them as a source of food while passing over the vast and barren parts of the ocean. But it's not just about staying fed, it's also about the potential for discovering new places, resources, and other civilizations along the path of the migration. But how would people actually travel? Are they just going to be swimming along the stream? Let's talk about some physical devices that your species might use. If you've enjoyed this video so far, give it a thumbs up, and let's delve into technologies and mechanisms for traveling long distance. Life beneath the waves is governed by the ebbs and flows of ocean current, something an intelligent aquatic species would certainly capitalize on. Much like our roads, the pathways and currents can facilitate efficient and fast travel. Strong currents similar to highways would be used for long-distance travel, especially the currents that flow across the entirety of an ocean. Smaller currents akin to streets and lanes might lead to specific destinations within these regions. And by understanding and mastering these natural waterways, our underwater civilization could traverse vast distances just by sitting in the flow. As we saw in the movie Finding Nemo, these currents are already used by creatures under the ocean. With sufficient magic, you could perhaps even make new currents, especially within a city. Although given the vast forces at play, that would be a very, very impressive feat, because currents are big gravitational forces that create these things. However, you could make travel along the currents easier by using beasts of burden. Several marine creatures come to mind that could serve as the horses of the sea. Larger species of dolphins or even whales could be domesticated, and they have remarkable speed and endurance. And perhaps they could be befriended or domesticated. Whales especially would be really good for long journeys across the ocean because you can also pack food onto them and just travel with them. In the case of short distance or heavy load transport, creatures like sea turtles or giant groupers could be suitable. These animals are known for their strength and stamina, even if they are not the fastest swimmers. I could definitely see potato bass as a domesticated species. They're super friendly towards scuba divers right now and will quite often come and investigate a scuba diver and very happily allow themselves to be touched. But riding a fish is probably not the most comfortable thing in the world. So let's consider some vehicles that people could make. At a rudimentary level, our aquatic civilization might develop harnesses or rigs to ride their aquatic steed more comfortably. So they could just have, because you don't need a wheel per se, they could just have like reins that attach to their steed that they hold on to, and then they're dragged through the water. But beyond this, they could employ the principles of biomimicry to design their own transportation devices, drawing inspiration from the efficiency and streamlined bodies of marine life. One can imagine bubble-like vehicles, which could either be magically constructed or biotech creations using strong and transparent materials like certain types of coral or shells. So you could have these shipyards where you literally grow these vehicles out of coral and then harvest them off the line. These vehicles could offer the ability to traverse different pressure zones, protect from predators, or even serve as mobile homes. And do remember the conversation about pressure from earlier. I definitely think vehicles would be rated for certain pressure loads and not for others. And if you take your near surface vessel down to 200 meters, you are out of warranty. Your civilization could also harness the incredible propulsion systems seen in nature. If you look at the fast techniques that the octopus uses to escape, they shoot a jet of water and propel themselves through the ocean very rapidly. Perhaps your underwater civilization could develop a similar propulsion method for high-speed travel. You could have water jet engines that fire a water stream and propel your vessel forward to take you on vast journeys in hours rather than days. But every journey must come to an end, and sometimes that end leads you to other people, and those other people could be hostile, or you could be a hostile colonial force. Either way, if you've enjoyed the video up to now, consider giving a super thanks and a thumbs up. And let's talk about warfare and weapons under the sea. Fighting beneath the ocean's surface presents a very different set of challenges and opportunities compared to terrestrial warfare. Traditional warfare tactics would have to be adjusted significantly to account for factors like drag, buoyancy, fluid dynamics, and the omnipresent pressure changes. In terms of weapons, some of our land-based implements would be completely impractical. Arrows, throwing stones, slings, these things won't work underwater due to water resistance, making those missiles travel very slowly and therefore being ineffective. Close combat weapons would likely dominate, with a focus on piercing instruments like spears or tridents, as slicing or blunt instruments again are hampered by water resistance. Remember, everything travels slower, so you want things that can pierce, which is why almost all animals underwater have piercing weapons when they have things that they thrust with. The use of domesticated or trained creatures could also play a significant role in combat underwater. Imagine warriors being, having reins on like armored dolphins or stingrays. Or a trained school of barracuda could serve as a moving, feeding frenzy of destruction. Poisonous creatures, like certain types of jellyfish or sea urchins, could be used as a sort of biological weapon, deterring attackers or setting up deadly traps. Let's explore weapon development in a bit more detail, since I found that thinking about how a weapon might evolve helped me come to grips with what kinds of weapons you might see under the water. So, in your phase 1, your basic tools, initially the first tools might have been similar to ours. Simple, naturally occurring objects that could be wielded as weapons. Underwater, this could be sturdy kelp stalks or a piece of coral, and it would be used to strike or poke at adversaries. A hardened shell could serve as a rudimentary shield against such a poking object. In phase 2, you would have tool refinement and material discovery. So as societies grew more sophisticated, so too would their weapons. They might learn to shape sturdy coral branches into more streamlined shape, reducing the drag and increasing their effectiveness as a stabbing weapon. They might discover different materials, particularly hard or sharp types of shells, minerals, or even the bones of certain marine creatures. And this would allow them to further expand their arsenal. The next phase could involve the domestication and use of marine life as weapons. As mentioned earlier, certain creatures could be trained for battle, but they could also be used to make weapons. The tough hide of large sea creatures could be used as armor, while the teeth or barbs of predatory fish could be harvested and used as natural daggers or as the heads of harpoons, as a simple coral stick becomes a harpoon, which is then used to stab forward, hook, and jerk back, doing additional damage. Finally, we come to the most advanced stage of the progression of weapons as these people learn more technology, and that would be bioengineering and magical infusion. So using biotechnology, these underwater societies could start growing their own weapons. So instead of just taking a piece of coral and shaping it, they could shape the way the coral grows itself and harvest their tridents from it. And you could have the corals grown to include, say, poison, or you could have them additionally incorporate other animals into like the head to create a harpoon and so on. And then further, infusing weapons with magic could increase their effectiveness. A spear could be enchanted to always find its target. A shield could be imbued with a spell that deflects incoming attacks. Magical enhancements might also overcome some of the challenges posed by the underwater environment, such as spells to reduce drag or to increase buoyancy. So when you're creating your underwater weapons, think of what your species would have started with in their caveman days and evolve the weapons as their tech increases. And this will give you some nicely diverse weaponry for your various societies to use, depending on their material availability and their magic. But of course, weapons are only one part of warfare. What would strategies and formations look like under the sea? Classic terrestrial formations like shield walls or phalanxes would be a little more impractical due to the three-dimensional nature of underwater combat. Instead, formations might be more fluid and dynamic, mimicking schools of fish or swarms of jellyfish. There would be a shift towards 3D maneuvers and flanking, taking advantage of the up and down as well as the around. Now, I'm definitely not a military strategist, but in order to illustrate this, I did come up with 3 possible formations to show you what I mean. And I created these formations based on watching some videos on sea creatures' attack strategies and defense strategies. So formation 1 is based on the orca's strategy for hunting. Orca pods are known for their strategic hunting techniques. They employ a coordinated approach to encircle and isolate their prey before launching a swift, lethal strike. An underwater civilization could adopt a similar formation. The soldiers would form a wide circle around the enemy, closing in from all sides, including up and down. This formation would give them control of the battlefield, allowing them to dictate the pace of the fight and isolate individual opponents for focused attacks. Formation 2, which I called the Barracuda Blitz, is based on barracuda, who are renowned for their speed and surprise element they bring to their attacks. So, borrowing from this formation would involve a loose, spread out formation to minimize the risk of a group attack counterattacking. At the commander's signal, the troops would then converge on the enemy with lightning speed from multiple directions. For this, you would obviously probably use some kind of cavalry equivalent. So maybe your intelligent species harness barracuda specifically for this and for their speed. This shock and awe approach would be especially effective in open waters where the element of surprise can turn the tide of battle. And then formation 3 is a defensive formation that I called the herring haven. Now, schools of small fish like herring often escape predators by forming massive, tightly packed balls. They move in unison, creating a mesmerizing, swirling mass that confuses and deters the predators. The herring haven is a defensive formation based on this strategy. The soldiers would back together tightly, moving as one to avoid enemy strikes. This formation would work well against attacks from all sides, providing a fortified defense and confusing the enemies with its fluid, ever-changing shape. So if you're coming up with battle formations for your underwater warfare, the way animals under the sea hunt and defend against hunts could be a great source of inspiration. Of course, when it comes to defending settlements, you do want fortifications. As I discussed in my video on the topic on land, you definitely are going to look for that kind of castle type structure, even if it doesn't look exactly the same. Coral fortifications could act as the first line of defense for your underwater civilization. Engineered and grown over time, these corals would form labyrinthine structures that not only provide a physical barrier, but could also serve as a confusing terrain for those trying to invade the city-state and places where ambushes could be set up by the defending soldiers in order to combat the incoming attackers. Coral fortifications, of course, would naturally blend with oceanic surroundings, making it difficult for enemies to distinguish the entrance points of your city. Then you could use stationary sea creatures to play a crucial role in defensive strategies. Sea anemones, for instance, could be nurtured around the fortifications at strategic points, and their venomous tentacles could be poised to sting unwelcome visitors. Octopi, with their high intelligence and camouflage capabilities, could serve as excellent sentinels, alerting the city to the approaching enemies and potentially setting up ambush points where they could attack incoming troops. So beyond these immediate defenses, the very pressure of ocean depth could also serve as a formidable deterrent. If you have multiple species of intelligent life underwater, those who are living at a depth have a natural defensive strategy in that it is difficult to reach for others. And there might even be people who have migrated to the depths and adjusted to living there in order to defend themselves against other of their own species. And this could give you varying races under the water that are of the same species, but Some of them have adapted to life at depth, and some of them still live higher up. And then, of course, magic would play a critical role here. You could have spells that manipulate water currents to create barriers or vortexes to repel or trap invaders. You could have enchantments that obscure or disguise settlements, or could make them harder to locate, even with echolocation. On the other hand, overcoming these defenses would require equally inventive offensive strategies. And you could really lean into magic there as well, perhaps having magic that blasts through coral, or magic that in a biological weaponry that makes coral sick. Or you could have potentially, attacking pods of dolphins or orcas with their echolocation that fan out to find where the city actually is. So I've spoken a lot about biotech and about domestication of creatures. I do think that this is going to be prevalent in an underwater civilization, just because there are so many creatures and many of them are stationary. I do also think that biotech would take the place of our smithing. I think that people would grow much of their technology. That shaping of the coral and perhaps speeding up of the growth of coral would become a base building block for your underwater civilization. But back to warfare, the possibilities for underwater warfare are pretty vast and exciting, from mundane strategies adapted to a new environment to unique weapons and magic that really can bring to life the zone underwater as your underwater species come into conflict. So if you enjoyed that discussion of warfare with a sideways dive into technology, hit the thumbs up button. And let's talk about the key components of warfare and exploration under the ocean. You must bear in mind the unique physics of the underwater environment, how it impacts movement, visibility, and weapon functionality. This affects everything from weapon design to the application of magic spells. Second, consider how the rich biodiversity of marine life could be used, from domestication of creatures for transport to their use of biological features for warfare and defense. Anemones, octopi, sea urchins, those little shells that shoot out poison darts, all of those things could be used by your species to defend and attack. Third, don't forget about the three-dimensional nature of underwater combat and how it would shift traditional battlefield formations and strategies. Fourth, integrate the vast potential of magical enhancements in your world, not just in warfare, but also in exploration and colonization. Finally, keep in mind the inherent dangers and challenges of deep-sea living, like pressure differentials, the lack of sunlight, and how your species would adapt to and utilize these in their favor. Remember, the sea is deep, and so should your imagination be when venturing into it. And those are my thoughts on exploration and warfare under the waves. If you want to say thanks for this video, super thanks is enabled, or you could become a channel member and get early access to my videos. And if you enjoyed this video, check out my video on creating ocean-going communities. And I will see you soon for another episode of Just in Time World.